This is why 90% of fighters are training their cardio wrong. As the tradition goes, no run, no fight. But it's not the running that I have the issue with, it's the application. And a new narrative review on Zone 2 training supports my position regarding traditional fight conditioning. Now, to give a brief description of how they defined Zone 2 in this narrative review, again, always checking my notes on my computer, so I'll be in and out looking at you and this. They considered exercise performed at intensities below lactate threshold 1, or demonstrating physiological responses consistent with the moderate intensity domain, so that's less than 2 millimoles per liter of blood lactate, below ventilatory threshold 1, below fat max, less than 45% of maximum rate of oxygen consumption, which would be VO2 max, to be Zone 2, which honestly you could just sum this up as low intensity, steady state cardio, a pace where you can talk to the person next to you while you perform the exercise. That would be the very easy way to define this, and how we can essentially just lump low intensity, steady state cardio is Zone 2 within this narrative review. Now, to preface this, there is a time and place for Zone 2 training. Yes, you don't have to throw everything out and just do one thing, but I will touch on that at the end of this video once I've gone through a lot of this data. And also, don't forget, if you are a fighter, sign up for my training app down in the description. You get access to every single program and a private community where you can talk to me, ask me questions, and get any help you need within your training. Or check out the free MMA or Jiu-Jitsu strength conditioning blueprints. They will take you through everything you need to know for strength conditioning for these combat sports. But let's get into this review. So this review shows why doing more Zone 2 training is most likely undercooking your fight cardio. And the authors state the popular narrative around Zone 2 is exercise intensity is the best at stimulating mitochondrial function and fat oxidation. Now, fat oxidation is not losing body fat, it's just using fat as fuel. Now, you've probably heard a lot of these from popular health influencer podcasts. I think Zone 2 has been on a real tear in the last maybe 4 or 5 years and kind of built momentum as the main driver for health and performance, which is quite interesting. And I think even before that, if you have read Ultimate MMA Conditioning by Joel Jamieson, there's also a big push towards Zone 2 or low intensity steady state cardio as well. But there might be an issue with this, because does it align with the current research that we have? And when we compare an equivalent volume of moderate intensity exercise, high intensity exercise generally results in greater mitochondrial signaling and adaptations. And I've referenced this paper before in previous videos, but Molman and colleagues demonstrate this in this graph right here. They show that all intensities led to similar increases in mitochondrial content. So we're talking about peripheral adaptations, or adaptations at the muscular level, which is going to help with our fatigue resistance. But sprint interval training was 2.3 times more efficient than high intensity training and 3.9 times more efficient than endurance training or low intensity steady state cardio. Now, that's not to say that the other methods are not effective. We're just talking about time efficiency in this instance in terms of mitochondrial content. But why is sprint interval training so effective in these short time frames? Well, if we go deep into this narrative review, they go into some of these pathways, which is quite cool. So the primary signaling pathway of mitochondrial biogenesis, or just creating new mitochondria, is the activation of the AMPK pathway in response to increased AMP and ADP and potentially reduced muscle glycogen. Let me explain this in a second. If you've listened to previous podcasts with Dr. John Babbright, one of the leading, probably the leading researcher in high intensity training and sprint interval training, he states that it only takes around 60 seconds of work to almost empty muscle glycogen stores. So if we talk about the potential of muscle glycogen reduction, helping induce the AMPK pathway to start creating more mitochondria, that's one way. Now, when we talk about AMP and ADP, if you're familiar with ATP, which is adenosine triphosphate, tri meaning 3 phosphates, AMP and ADP would be 1 phosphate and 2 phosphates respectively. Obviously, as the ATP gets used for fuel, you then lose phosphate molecules. They become ADP, diphosphate, AMP, monophosphate, in a nutshell. But this increase in AMP and ADP, which would be because ATP is being used and you're getting a buildup of ADP and AMP, this also activates the endurance pathway, which you'll see in this graph here. You'll see the two kind of pathways from a high volume approach and a high intensity approach. Now, you'll see they both lead to the master switch, which I've named it here, which is PGC1A, which then leads to those cascading adaptations that we're after. Now, the effects of Zone 2 exercise on PGC1A, according to this narrative review, is unclear. Now, you can see in this little graph that's up that the high volume training route, which is the Zone 2, goes through a different pathway through calcium. But don't worry about that for now. What they found was in this narrative review that no change in PGC1A gene expression was reported following 30 minutes and approximately 90 minutes of zone 2 exercise. So if you're typically prescribed or at least recommended for general health and for sports performance to do 30 to 90 minutes of zone 2, and that is what is going to get you the adaptations that you need from it. Well, according to the research that they currently see, might not be the case. And the reason is that the subjects in these studies were relatively well trained. We're talking VO2 maxes of 59 milliliters per minute per kg, which is much higher. Well, let's say it's a lot higher than many elite combat sport athletes from the research that we have. Typically for combat sport athletes, we're looking at anywhere from 40, 45 to up to about 55 milliliters per minute per kg for VO2 max. So this is creeping up closer into that more well-trained endurance athlete. And that may partly explain the absence of mitochondrial biogenic response, as in creating new mitochondria. Supramaximal intensities, as in above VO2 max during training, may be required to induce mitochondrial adaptations in well-trained populations. And interestingly enough, while this narrative review states this, we also have that Molman and colleagues paper again to show this exact thing. So if you check this graph here, we see on the very right-hand side of the graph where it says well-trained. Well-trained athletes didn't show any change in mitochondrial content when expressed per hour of training after endurance training and high-intensity training, but not for sprint interval training. Further, several studies do not support the ability of zone 2 training to improve mitochondrial capacity. So again, we're getting to this point where as you become more well-trained, you need intensity within your training to be able to further elicit these changes that we want to help you as a combat sports athlete. Now, if you think of conditioning as on a spectrum, our zone 2 or low intensity steady state cardio, and then I'll say our very high intensity sprint intervals, one's volume, one's intensity. If you want to further elicit change with a low intensity approach, the only thing you can do is further increase volume. And obviously you can understand that can be problematic with tight schedules, you're training combat sports very often, the repetitive nature of doing a lot of volume of zone 2, and having time probably better spent somewhere else. So narrative review goes on to state that results from a detailed meta-analysis of exercise intensity and mitochondrial adaptation suggest that exercise performed below 60% maximum work rate, which is an intensity equivalent to or above zone 2, is not expected to improve mitochondrial content or mitochondrial respiratory capacity. Exercise above zone 2 results in greater changes in our AMP ADP to ATP ratio. So we talked about that increase in AMP ADP to be able to signal the AMPK pathway. Declines in phosphocreatine, increases in intramuscular lactate, and decreases in pH. Although long durations, which is approximately 120 to 211 minutes of zone 2, result in glycogen depletion, rates of glycogen depletion increase with increasing exercise intensity. So we can increase the rates of glycogen depletion to be able to signal that pathway for more mitochondria through essentially any form of exercise. But the more intense, the faster that happens, and the faster we can start to signal to the body to create new mitochondria, which is why, for example, 60 seconds of total work of sprint intervals can do that. They go on to further state that the downstream mitochondrial signaling pathways are also activated to a greater extent following exercise intensities above zone 2. And I bring this graph up again here. Those are the downstream mitochondrial signaling pathways, as you can see, through PGC1 and then all the different changes below. So these results suggest that exercise performed above zone 2 may be superior for inducing mitochondrial adaptations, directly contradicting the notion that zone 2 training is the optimal intensity for such outcomes. It may be that the high mitochondrial capacity of elite endurance athletes is more related to their training spent above zone 2 rather than their large volumes of zone 2 training per se. So a typical elite endurance athlete training schedule is about 80% of their total training volume done at the very low intensities. We're talking in that kind of zone 1, zone 2 range. And then 20% are spent in essentially zone 3 and above, or higher intensity conditioning. And what this paper is suggesting is that maybe those mitochondrial changes are actually from the higher intensity training that they're doing versus all of the low intensity work. Now, endurance sports and combat sports are two entirely different things. Of course, endurance athletes are going to spend a lot of time in low intensity zones and getting a lot of miles in because their sport is covering a lot of miles. They're essentially practicing the sport by doing this. For combat sports, you're getting a lot of this low intensity work within the training itself. So you need to be able to tap into potentially other methods to be able to enhance your conditioning and most likely you need to do it through better mitochondrial function and having more mitochondria. This is going to most likely transfer better to your fight conditioning because it is likely more limited peripherally or at the muscular level than what happens at the heart. And they go on to say that prioritizing high intensity exercise appears critical when designing exercise programs to improve cardiorespiratory fitness and reduce chronic disease risk, especially when training time is limited. Now, I love that last part, especially when training time is limited. Now, even though this is really more focused on general population because they're talking about chronic disease risk, etc., the training when time is limited directly applies to you as a combat athlete because you're either working full-time and training and have a family, or you're a full-time professional athlete, but you're training 2-3 times a day of your combat sport. So fitting in hours of extra low-intensity cardio may not be the best option. Now, this narrative review supports many of the previous videos I've done around high-intensity training within your conditioning. I'll link one of them at the end of this video, but there's a bunch you can go back and see. But as I mentioned before, you probably have limited time. A conditioning approach focused on super maximal intensities, we're talking well above VO2 max, provides fight-specific adaptations in a fraction of the time compared to waking up at 5 a.m. for an hour and going for a run before work. And that's not to say that you cannot take a lower intensity approach or even a high intensity interval training approach. It's just all about time. You get similar outcomes with these different types of training, just through different pathways, but you're gonna be either spending more time doing it or less time doing it. Now, I know what some of you might be thinking. What about the narrative surrounding eccentric versus concentric left ventricular hypertrophy? And if you're not familiar, it's probably one of the main, I guess you could say one of the main points that often gets taken from Ultimate MMA Conditioning, the book. And it's essentially, I'll throw a little picture up here anyway, but I'm gonna put this really simply. The heart chamber is getting larger to pump more blood, or smaller, reducing blood volume that can be pumped. So eccentric hypertrophy of that chamber means it's getting larger, concentric means it's getting smaller. One of the prevailing thoughts for pushing a ton of low intensity conditioning for fighters, and this is I think where a lot of the main philosophy around Ultimate MMA Conditioning really is the idea that high intensity training causes concentric hypertrophy of the heart, reducing blood volume and therefore oxygen delivery, which then results in you being quote unquote less fit. Now, that was one of the main takeaways that I took from the book when I first read it was, hey, if you're doing too much high intensity work, you're going to reduce your aerobic ability and then you're just going to be less fit. And so there's a push and pull with high intensity, low intensity. You just spend most of your time doing low intensity work so you can improve that stroke volume and cardiac output. But when I dug into the literature to try and find research that support this, I didn't find much at all. In fact, all I really found was a study comparing endurance athletes to strength trained athletes, which we can't really extrapolate these two because the strength trained athletes are literally just in the gym lifting weights, and then the endurance athletes are literally just doing endurance training. Whereas if you're a multidisciplinary athlete, like a combat athlete, you're doing both. And further, strength trained athletes aren't doing sprint intervals or high intensity conditioning. So that's all I could really find. And this paper mentions the effects when strength training that results in concentric hypertrophy of the heart. So since high intensity interval training or sprint interval training is not in these papers, I would argue that high intensity cardio isn't leading to a smaller heart chamber and making you less fit, especially when we see increased time to exhaustion after sprint interval training, indicating better central function or better heart function. We also see from the Molman and colleagues paper, improvements in VO2 max initially from sprint interval training, which means most likely improved central function of the heart. But if I missed a paper and you know of one that I completely just didn't find that shows high intensity conditioning leads to concentric left ventricular hypertrophy, please link me in the comments or DM me. I'd love to actually see it and read it and update, whatever I have here in this video. But now, as promised, there is a time and place for using zone 2 or low intensity steady state cardio. I'm giving it to you now. If you're relatively out of shape, for example, if your resting heart rate is above 50, 55-ish, you're set in stone, you may benefit from a short cycle of building volume through easy zone 2, maybe 2 to 4 weeks, before you move into some of your high intensity work. If you don't have a heart rate monitor, you could perform a maximal aerobic speed test by running a mile or doing a 6-minute time trial on some kind of off-peak cardio equipment. If it takes you 6 minutes or longer for this mile, which would approximately be a 3.8 meters per second MAS score, you may also warrant some zone 2 work. And now, this isn't This isn't a hard and fast cutoff rule. This is just based on my experience having tested quite a few athletes through a similar test and seen normative data from a lot of different sports. So don't take this as gospel, just treat it as a very general guideline. So that'll be one example of where you could use, say, a small block of zone 2 training. Another is if you're coming back from injury or an extended time off. The first thing you want to do is, or the last thing you want to do is jump on an air bike and absolutely go balls out on your very first day back. So easy way back into training with a few weeks of zone 2. Now, the other issue, well, let's call it an issue. The other thing that could arise is what if you just love running and you don't want to give up your road work? You have a couple of options. Reduce your running to once a week. The rest of your conditioning will be on a bike for sprint intervals or something similar. The running can either be hill sprints, which will be one of your sprint interval sessions, or you could do a long high intensity interval training hill run if you want more variation in the intensity. Some examples of these hill sprint sessions could be 6 to 15 second sprints with walk back recovery, which would be around 1 to 2 minutes, and accumulate 1 to 2 minutes of total work. For your long hill runs, it could be multiple rounds of 2 to 3 minutes at a relatively fast pace, not a full sprint. Your other option is, if you have no hill, is to turn your zone 2 runs into more intense intervals. For example, Andrew Usher, who you should listen to on the 3 Times Fighting podcast, and you should be in the conditioning mentorship with him, likes his athletes to do various 1, 2, and 3 kilometer efforts with 1 minute rest between, which makes sense, especially within sports like boxing, where even though the sport is or looks intermittent, meaning it's more interval based to the eye, when you actually look at the muscular data, it's actually more steady state. So being able to have a very fast 1, 2, or 3K time is likely beneficial for sports like boxing, and you'll probably find similar with MMA. Another option is to use your MAS score and build long or short intervals based on your score. So for example, if your score is 4 meters per second, again, very simple. If you just do your 1600 meter or your 1 mile run, you take the distance in meters, you divide that by the time in seconds that it took you, that'll give you the meters per second score. So if you had 4 meters per second and you're doing, say, 100% mass run with 70% mass recovery for 5 minutes, for 15 seconds on, 15 seconds off, that would be 60 meters of distance to cover during the work effort for 15 seconds, and then 42 meters for the recovery run for the next 15 seconds. Do that for 5 minutes, do it for 3 sets. Pretty simple. You can also add more intensity to that MAS, and then you're training at intensities above essentially your VO2 max. This way you can start to target runs to your individual current conditioning shape instead of just blindly guessing a lot of it. Again, there's no one method to do your conditioning. You don't have to just do a sprint interval training approach or a high intensity interval training approach or zone 2 training approach. You can kind of use a little bit of all of them, but there is just more time efficient ways to do things. And often most fighters, and I guess generally athletes, aren't doing the very most high intense sprint intervals at all in their training. They think they're doing the high intensity, but they're really not. And that is one of the reasons why I have a big push towards them, because once you feel the intensity of a sprint interval, you'll understand why you need it. Now, if you want to go more in depth into a lot of this conditioning talk, make sure you watch this video next, because I share a lot of information in there for your conditioning.